She thought she was stopping a suspect. Instead, she slapped a sitting judge in open court. What happened next unraveled 15 years of unchecked power in just 10 seconds. This isn't fiction. It's real, raw, and every second was caught on video. Curious how one moment exposed an entire system? Stick around. Like, share, and subscribe. We tell the stories others won't touch, with truth at the center. You don't want to miss this. It was supposed to be a routine morning in Monroe County, one of those quiet, forgettable court sessions that drift through the calendar without anyone blinking. Tuesday, 9:25 a.m., Courtroom 4C. A minor drug possession case. Nothing high profile, nothing dramatic. The fluorescent lights hummed. The clerk adjusted her files. A young public defender tapped notes into her tablet. The defendant sat at the front, knees jittering. It should have been just another day. Then Officer Danielle Krauss walked in. She moved with the kind of authority that doesn't ask for space. It takes it. Decorated, confident, and fiercely feared by both peers and the public, she wore her crisp uniform like armor. 15 years on the force, rising through the ranks faster than most, she had built her career on aggressive patrols and uncompromising control. Her reputation preceded her. No nonsense, always right, never questioned. And if you dared to question her, you usually regretted it. She entered the courtroom with her jaw clenched tight, her boots hitting the floor in clean, echoing thuds. Eyes forward. No smile. She wasn't here to play witness. She was here to assert presence. Then it happened. Near the witness box stood a sharply dressed black man. No robe, no gavel. Just a dark navy suit, a silver tie pin, and a calm conversation with one of the attorneys. He wasn't standing like he was waiting to be called. He was standing like he belonged there, like he owned the space. For Krauss, that was enough. Something in her flared. Reflex, not reason. Assumption, not awareness. The courtroom may have been still, but inside Krauss, something snapped. Without a word, she stormed across the floor. No one stopped her. Not the bailiff shifting nervously by the door. Not the clerk who instinctively glanced up and froze. Not even the young defendant who blinked in disbelief. And then, in front of 24 people and half a dozen smartphones, she slapped him. Hard. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a whip. Sharp. Undeniable. It cut through the soft murmur of conversation and fluttering papers like a lightning strike through glass. Gasps rose from every corner. A pen rolled off a desk. Someone dropped their file folder. A reporter in the back turned around mid-sentence, mouth hanging open. For a moment, maybe 2, maybe 10, the world seemed to stop spinning. And the man? The one she struck? He didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't lunge or raise a hand. He calmly reached up, adjusted his tie, and brushed the side of his face with the back of his hand. His posture didn't break. His voice didn't tremble. "I'm Judge Miles Harrington," he said evenly, eyes locked on hers, "and I'll be presiding today." That's when the silence changed. It wasn't just shock anymore. It was weight. Thick, suffocating weight. A collective realization sinking into every face in that room. Krauss blinked. Once. Twice. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her hand, the one she used, hung stiff at her side, trembling slightly. The bailiff didn't know whether to intervene or vanish. The defense attorney instinctively reached for her phone. Others followed suit. Within seconds, 4 phones were recording. Maybe 5. No commentary, no narration. Just cold, clean footage of a white cop in uniform slapping a black judge in open court. Krauss stammered, "I thought he wasn't supposed to be," but the words never found form. They floated and fell like ash in a windless room. Judge Harrington didn't say another word. He turned toward the courtroom, face unreadable, and announced, "We'll take a 10-minute recess." Then he walked, slow and deliberate, through the side door into his chambers. He didn't slam it. He didn't shout. And that, somehow, was even louder. No one in courtroom 4C moved. Not for 10 full seconds. It wasn't clear what to do. Stand? Sit? Leave? There were no rules for this moment. The prosecutor leaned toward Krauss and whispered, "You just assaulted a judge." Her face went pale. Her breath came short. Her feet, usually so sure, stayed planted. She looked like the floor had vanished beneath her, and she was just now realizing there was nothing to catch her. Within 20 minutes, the courthouse buzzed with whispers. By noon, the video had been clipped, uploaded, and tweeted. The caption was brutally simple. "Cop slaps judge. Doesn't know he's the judge." At first, people thought it was staged, some satirical skit. But it wasn't. There was no music, no staging, no angles, just fluorescent lighting, real shock, and the small chaos of real life unfolding unfiltered. This was no misunderstanding. This was a moment of naked truth. A raw exposure of what happens when reflex meets bias, when assumption collides with reality, and when the person you think you can control turns out to be the one holding the gavel. So if you're still watching, if you felt your chest tighten, if you paused, rewound, and replayed that moment, you're not alone. Because this wasn't just one officer making a mistake. It was the tip of something bigger, and what came after would shake the very institution she thought she owned. Like, share, and subscribe, because this story is far from over. The slap didn't echo only through courtroom 4C. It cracked across the entire county like a thunderclap. By the time Judge Miles Harrington stepped into his chambers and closed the door behind him, the moment was already in motion. The phones that had captured it were uploading. The whispers had become texts. And the courthouse, that old stone relic that had stood for over 90 years without ever making national news, was now a digital flashpoint. At 9:48 a.m., the first clip hit social media. Just 15 seconds. No commentary. No editing. Just the slap, the collective gasp, and Judge Harrington's calm declaration, "I'm Judge Miles Harrington, and I'll be presiding today." It landed with the sharpness of a live wire. Within minutes, reposts multiplied. On Twitter, someone added the caption, "Cop slaps a judge. Doesn't know he's the judge." This is not a joke. By 10:30, the video had been viewed over 100,000 times. Local news stations scrambled to verify it, their reporters rushing into the courthouse with coffee still in hand, faces tight with urgency. The initial coverage was cautious. Phrases like "alleged altercation" and "unconfirmed reports" dotted early headlines. But that caution didn't last. By noon, the county's press office confirmed that a judge had, in fact, been assaulted in court. And yes, it was Judge Harrington. And yes, the officer involved was Danielle Krauss. And then the headlines sharpened like knives. "Cop strikes judge in courtroom chaos." "Slap heard round Monroe County." "Uniform doesn't hide bias. It broadcasts it." Cable news anchors called it an extraordinary breach of protocol. Commentators debated whether it was a hate crime. Podcasts picked it up within hours. The slap, as it came to be known, had entered the bloodstream of public discourse, and it wasn't going away. But it wasn't just the media firestorm that made it viral. It was the tone of the moment, the quiet after the strike, the disbelief on Krauss's face, the silence in the room, the way Judge Harrington didn't shout or flinch or retaliate, just corrected her with calm, devastating clarity. "I'll be presiding today." Those 5 words landed like a gavel, striking the soul of the system. What came next wasn't a frenzy. It was a flood. By late afternoon, people across the country had seen the clip. Civil rights attorneys reposted it with captions like, "This is what happens when implicit bias is left unchecked." Community organizers in Ohio called emergency meetings. Former defendants started commenting under news stories, saying things like, "That's her. She cuffed me at gunpoint in front of my kids for a broken taillight." And then came the threads. Twitter users, law students, ex-cops, public defenders began compiling a record of Officer Danielle Krauss's career. Bits and pieces, clues. A blog post from 2 years ago describing her as hardline to the point of paranoia. A YouTube video from a community board meeting where a black mother quietly accused a white female officer of humiliating her daughter during a traffic stop. It all began to connect. By evening, a full dossier was forming, not through internal affairs, but through the digital crowd. People didn't need credentials. They had receipts. Reddit threads lit up. Facebook timelines swelled with commentary. TikTok creators stitched clips of the slap with first-hand accounts. One creator titled their video, "The Cop Who Thought Her Badge Made Her God." It got 3 million views in 8 hours. But as the views climbed, the tone shifted. At first, it was confusion. Could this really happen? Was it staged? Surely, no officer would be reckless enough to strike a stranger in court, much less a sitting judge. But as more evidence rolled in, the disbelief turned into fury. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom. Activists from Columbus, Dayton, and Cincinnati began organizing. Not protests, forums. They called it the Reckoning Table. Community members gathered in libraries, churches, and high school gyms to talk about their experiences. Many of them had never come forward before. Now, they felt they had to. One of the first voices to go viral came from a man named Jordan Bell, a warehouse worker who claimed Krauss had arrested him at age 17 for suspicious loitering while he waited for a bus. He uploaded his own video response. No polish, no edits, just a shaky voice, a tired face, and a story. She looked at me like I wasn't supposed to be there, like being black and standing still was a crime. I told her I was waiting for the number 6 bus. She told me not to get smart. Then she cuffed me. His story wasn't unusual, but now it wasn't just a statistic. It was personal, tangible. You could see the emotion in his eyes, feel the weight in his voice. That's what made this different. The slap made it visible, undeniable. Even former officers began speaking up, anonymously at first. One post read, "I saw her rough up a kid once over a vape pen. She laughed about it afterward, said it would teach him to respect blue." By 9 p.m., local radio shows had opened the lines. Callers flooded in, some angry, some heartbroken, all stunned. "We always knew there were officers like her," one caller said. "We just never thought they'd fall in public." But fall she did. Behind closed doors, the Monroe County Sheriff's Office scrambled. They issued a brief statement. "We are aware of the incident involving Officer Danielle Krauss. An investigation is underway." But no apology, no clarification, just procedural padding. Meanwhile, Officer Krauss had vanished from public view. No comment, no appearance, no denial. Her silence, once perceived as strength, now read as avoidance. Her power, once drawn from fear and authority, was dissolving in real time. But the most haunting part? Judge Harrington still hadn't said a word. No interviews, no press conferences, just a closed chamber door and the sense that something deeper was coming. A reckoning not just for Krauss, but for every system that had let her rise, unchecked. Because in 15 seconds, one video did what 100 complaints never could. It exposed the reflex. Not the crime, but the assumption behind it. The unspoken rule that some people look like suspects even when they're not. Even when they're judges. And that's why the slap wasn't just about Danielle Krauss. It was about all the rooms she walked into for 15 years, where no one stopped her, no one questioned her, and no one filmed her. Until now. Now the whole country was watching. And it wasn't just viral, it was personal. Stay with us, because the next part of this story, that's where the system starts to speak back. Or stay silent. Like, share, and subscribe. This is the kind of truth that doesn't come quietly. Before the video went viral, before the hashtags, before the courtroom fell into that silent, stunned stillness, Officer Danielle Krauss was not just a cop, she was the cop. In Monroe County, her name carried weight. 15 years on the force had made her a local icon of authority. The kind of officer featured on community safety night flyers. The kind who sat on panels with mayors, shaking hands while quoting policy. Her photos hung in break rooms. Her speeches were clipped into highlight reels. Promotions came fast. Rookie at 22, sergeant by 26, task force lead by 30. And each new stripe came with applause, not questions. She moved like someone who believed in her own legend, and the department helped write it. She wore her uniform like armor, and the county let her. To those who didn't know her work up close, she was a model of law and order. Sharp, decisive, the kind of officer who never blinked under pressure. She spoke at conferences about risk management in urban zones and street-level vigilance, all buzzwords that made decision-makers nod, while communities flinched. Newspapers called her tough but fair, a phrase that always seemed to be reserved for people who cracked down on the poor. But behind the polished citations and front-page praise was a story Monroe County didn't want to see, one buried under years of silence, stamped reports, and institutional protection. Because under the mask of authority, Krauss wasn't a model of justice. She was a storm, and she always moved through the same streets. Ask anyone in the East Hollow corridor, or the Bellwood housing stretch, or the old shopping plaza off Route 19. Ask the Black and Latino residents who saw her patrol car and held their breath. She didn't de-escalate. She dominated. And if she stopped you, it didn't matter what you were doing. It was already too late to explain. Over the years, the complaints piled up. Quiet, detailed, and always dismissed. A teenage boy slammed against a cruiser for walking home too slowly. A pregnant woman forced to sit on a curb while her car was searched for the smell of marijuana that no one else noticed. A middle school teacher pulled over on his way to work, asked where he was really headed, then ticketed for failure to signal in a turn-only lane. These weren't isolated. They were ritual. But internal affairs never saw a pattern. They saw unsubstantiated claims. That's how they labeled each one: rubber-stamped, filed, and forgotten. The officers who tried to speak up, reassigned, ignored, or warned. The officers who stayed silent, promoted, rewarded. The system didn't just fail to stop her. It quietly built itself around her. And at the center of it all was Chief Raymond Keel, Krauss's longtime mentor and protector. A 35-year veteran of the Monroe County Force, Keel called her a product of real policing. He liked her edge, her presence, her refusal to back down. Behind closed doors, he often said she had the stomach for this job, as if empathy was a weakness and restraint a liability. Early in her career, Keel took her under his wing. He saw her aggression as loyalty. When a civil rights complaint surfaced in year 4, Keel personally closed the investigation. Community tension, he wrote in the file. shouldn't cloud tactical decisions. Krauss learned early that as long as she delivered arrests, seizures, bodies in cuffs, she would be protected. She didn't need to follow the rules. She just needed to look like she was. She built her career on that understanding. And the higher she climbed, the more invincible she felt. It wasn't just how she policed, it was why she policed. Power wasn't a tool for her, it was an identity. Her badge didn't represent law, it represented her belief that law belonged to her. She spoke about respect often, especially in precinct meetings, when describing suspects who didn't know their place. She laughed about making grown men cry in interrogation. Once, after tackling a 14-year-old for mouthing off, she told her partner, "That kid's gonna remember the taste of concrete every time he thinks about stepping out of line." The partner filed a soft complaint. It never saw daylight. Inside the department, people noticed, but no one acted. Because Krauss wasn't an anomaly. She was an example. Officers didn't fear she would turn on them. They feared what would happen if they didn't stand beside her. She made it clear, "You cross me, you're gone." And she had Keel's backing to prove it. Still, the cracks were forming. Slowly, steadily. A new city council had taken office just 6 months before the courtroom incident, promising more oversight. A community advisory board had started sniffing around old arrest logs. Internal affairs got a leadership shakeup. There was talk, nothing loud, but enough to make Krauss bristle. She called it soft policing at a precinct barbecue, joked that the city was going liberal. Her allies laughed, but some didn't. Some were already stepping back. And then came the slap. The 15-second clip that no one could explain away. The moment she lost control, in front of people who'd never been afraid to say what they saw. And this time, no one could sweep it under the rug, not with the whole world watching. Because in that slap, in that one open-handed strike, everything she tried to keep hidden became visible. The mask cracked. The record was pulled. And what once looked like strength began to look like rot. The kind of rot people had been trying to warn about for years. It wasn't just a mistake. It was the result of years of deliberate protection. Danielle Krauss hadn't just operated in a broken system. She had benefited from its silence. She had become its embodiment. But now the silence was breaking. And the authority she wore like armor? It was starting to peel away, one layer at a time. While Officer Danielle Krauss built her career in the spotlight, feeding off fear and flashing badges at press conferences, Judge Miles Harrington carved his legacy in quiet rooms, behind courtroom doors, and in the deliberate pauses between decisions. In the same county that had shielded Krauss's aggression for 15 years, Harrington had spent 12 steady years on the bench. Rarely quoted, never flashy, and deeply respected by those who mattered most. The overlooked, the accused, the voiceless, and the painfully aware. His courtroom didn't echo with ego. It settled with dignity. And yet, in a moment that lasted less than 10 seconds, the two collided. One built on spectacle, the other on silence. When Krauss slapped him across the face in front of a packed courtroom, it didn't just expose her. It revealed him too. Because Judge Harrington didn't flinch. He didn't roar. He didn't retaliate. He simply adjusted his tie, met her eyes, and said, "I'm Judge Miles Harrington, and I'll be presiding today." Those words didn't just land. They rang. They rang through that courtroom like a bell tolling for everything the county had ignored. Because power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks with restraint so sharp it leaves the room gasping. To understand the force of that moment, you have to know who Miles Harrington is. He didn't come from legacy or wealth or courthouse lineage. He came from St. Glenn, a working-class neighborhood 10 miles east of Monroe, where school books were taped at the spine and kids got their grit from the pavement. He was the first in his family to go to college, the first to step into a courtroom not as a defendant or witness, but as counsel. He spent 7 years as a public defender, sitting beside the forgotten, the judged before they spoke, the ones with court-appointed silence, and 2 minutes to explain their lives to a jury. He didn't forget those years when he switched sides and wore the robe. He carried them with him, every time he asked a question, every time he paused before ruling, every time he looked a young man in the eyes and asked, "Did anyone ever listen to you before today?" Harrington's chambers weren't adorned with prestige. There was no Ivy League diploma framed in gold, just a shelf lined with casebooks, a black-and-white photo of his wife and their 2 sons, and a small wooden gavel carved by his youngest during a 6th-grade woodshop class. It sat beside his docket, like a quiet anchor. He didn't boast about his credentials. He let his record speak. Those who stood before him knew one thing: if Judge Harrington ruled against you, he had read everything. And if he ruled for you, it wasn't sympathy. It was justice. He wasn't interested in becoming a social media icon. He wasn't chasing headlines. That's why, when the courtroom slap went viral, 12 million views in 24 hours, Judge Harrington didn't post a statement. He didn't hold a press conference or stand behind a podium. He didn't call for charges or fire off condemnations. He didn't even correct the dozens of talking heads who mispronounced his name in interviews. Instead, he did what he always did. He watched and waited and listened to what the system would do next. That silence wasn't passivity. It was a challenge. He knew the structure better than anyone. He knew its reflex to protect itself, to delay, to drown outrage in bureaucracy and ongoing investigations. He'd seen officers with records like Krauss's be reassigned, not reprimanded. He'd watched internal reviews drag until public attention faded. But this time, with the world watching, he refused to become part of the noise. He didn't want spectacle. He wanted accountability. And he knew if he raised his voice too early, the focus would shift from her actions to his response. So he sat at his desk, read case files, signed orders, sipped cold coffee like nothing had happened, except everything had. His clerk, Darrell Tran, later said that the judge barely spoke that day. Just nodded once when asked if he wanted to press charges. "Let's see what they do when they think no one's forcing their hand." That was the judge's only reply, because Harrington wasn't new to disrespect. It had followed him in subtle and sharp forms for decades, from court officers mistaking him for a defendant in his early years, to lawyers assuming he wasn't the judge, to bailiffs explaining basic procedure to him like he hadn't written the bench manual. And yet, he never raised his voice. He raised expectations. He didn't demand respect. He earned it through clarity, consistency, and command that never relied on volume. He believed that dignity wasn't a performance. It was a posture. And when Krauss struck him, what she didn't realize was that she hadn't just assaulted a man. She had exposed the truth about how reflexive her power had become. That she could look at a well-dressed black man in a courtroom and, without hesitation, assume she had authority over him. Assume she could silence him with her hand. But Harrington didn't fight back, because he didn't need to. The moment itself was already louder than anything he could say. In the days that followed, the public waited for him to act. His inbox flooded. Journalists reached out. Legal advocates offered support. People chanted his name at rallies. But he never took the stage. He never tweeted. When asked by a reporter outside the courthouse if he planned to file charges, he answered with one line, "I expect the system to handle this the way it would if it were anyone else." That was it, and that was enough, because with that one sentence, he handed the burden back to Monroe County, to the department, to the same walls that had defended Officer Krauss for 15 years. He didn't tell them what justice looked like. He let them show who they really were. And slowly, the silence started working. Internal Affairs opened investigations. The City Council requested records. Former officers came forward. Witnesses surfaced. And all the while, Judge Harrington returned to his courtroom every morning. Black robe brushing his shoes, gavel in hand, voice measured. He wasn't out for revenge. He didn't need to destroy anyone. He just waited for the truth to do what truth always does when it's finally seen. Correct. That's who Judge Miles Harrington is. Quiet power. Relentless fairness. And the kind of man who knows you don't have to raise your voice to be heard. Especially when everything around you is finally listening. The silence that followed Judge Harrington's measured restraint didn't signal peace. It signaled pressure. Pressure building behind every locked file, beneath every redacted report, inside every police locker room where jokes were made, just loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to be denied. When Judge Harrington refused to rage, refused to shout, refused to make himself the center of the storm, the focus turned to the walls around him, the department, the culture, the protection that let Officer Danielle Krauss operate unchecked for 15 years. That silence wasn't surrender. It was an invitation. And people finally started answering it. The first crack came quietly, through an email flagged confidential. Detective Lena Torres had worked the same precinct as Krauss for over a decade. She was sharp, steady, and had long learned the cost of speaking too soon. Years earlier, she'd tried to push back when Krauss manipulated a suspect into signing a false confession. The backlash was immediate. A cold shoulder from the chief. A reassignment to paperwork duty. A message, loud and clear. You're either in or you're out. After that, Torres kept her head down. Until now. The video changed something. Watching Krauss slap a sitting judge in open court wasn't just horrifying, it was a breaking point. It was proof that Danielle had come to believe there were no rules, only instincts. In her statement to Internal Affairs, Torres didn't hold back. "I was threatened in the locker room," she wrote. She said if I ever questioned her reports again, I'd find myself reassigned to the grave shift in South Monroe. And she didn't mean nights. That testimony was logged, time-stamped, and immediately flagged for senior review. It was the first formal crack in the department's wall of silence. But it wasn't the last. Officer Eli Grafton was only 23 when he rode with Krauss during his 3rd month out of the academy. He was still figuring out the rhythm of patrols, still unsure when to speak and when to nod. But even then, something felt off. Krauss wasn't training him. She was showing him how to dominate. 6 car stops in one shift, all within a 3-block stretch. All black drivers. Not one infraction justified. He'd asked once, carefully, why they were targeting a certain area. Krauss had smirked and said, "Because that's where the numbers are, rookie." Grafton wrote a memo, brief, cautious, but clear. It made its way to a supervisor. 2 weeks later, he was reassigned to desk duty at a station 40 minutes outside the city. That had been a year ago. Now, with the video still spreading, Grafton came forward, this time on record. His voice shook during the interview, but his words didn't waver. "I thought if I said something, I'd be seen as soft. But it was wrong. I saw it. I knew it." His testimony added weight. Not just anecdote, pattern. A pattern of intimidation, retaliation, and unchecked bias. And the public was listening. By the 3rd day after the incident, reporters were camped outside the Monroe County Justice Center. Council members began calling emergency sessions. Local activist groups, previously ignored, were suddenly getting meeting invites. And inside the department, things were shifting. You could feel it in the way people walked. Conversations that once ended in nervous laughter now ended in silence. The usual jokes stopped. Officers who once backed Krauss with blind loyalty were now watching their words. The pressure had turned inward. The department's leadership, once solid behind Chief Raymond Keel, began to fracture. Keel himself hadn't made a public appearance since the slap, and his office released only a single vague statement. "We are investigating all matters related to the incident and will act accordingly." But the city council wasn't waiting anymore. New oversight policies, previously stalled for budget review, were pushed forward. Internal Affairs received a surge of interview requests from current and former officers. Most didn't want their names revealed, but they all said the same thing. She made it clear you were either with her or beneath her. That phrase kept repeating. One officer described a moment 4 years earlier when Krauss stormed into the evidence locker and demanded access to sealed material for a case she wasn't assigned to. When questioned, she slammed her hand on the desk and said, "I get what I want. That's how this works." No one stopped her. Now, people were admitting they should have. Because what they'd all watched in that courtroom wasn't just a mistake. It was the physical expression of unchecked power. A slap, yes, but also a signal. A flag planted in the middle of Monroe County's justice system that said, "This is how deep it runs." And once it became public, there was no putting it back. Even the union, long criticized for circling the wagons around controversial officers, issued a neutral statement by day 5. "We believe in due process for all involved." It was cold, distant, and far less protective than Krauss had expected. Behind the scenes, she'd called them, twice. No answer. Meanwhile, Internal Affairs had opened 7 separate case reviews into previous arrests linked to Krauss. Files were pulled. Dashcam footage, previously unflagged, was reevaluated. Community members who had given up on being heard were now being called back. People who had been dismissed for years were finally being asked the one question they never thought they'd hear. What happened? And as all of this unfolded, Judge Harrington never said a word. He kept presiding over cases. He greeted his clerk each morning. He ruled on motions with the same steady cadence. But those who looked closely saw it. The slight tightening of his jaw when Krauss's name came up in court. The way his fingers hovered over the gavel just a beat longer. He was waiting for the system to do what it had failed to do for 15 years. Not because he believed in its perfection, but because he believed the system needed to be forced to look at itself. And now, for the first time in a long time, it was. The armor that once protected Krauss, her reputation, her rank, her alliances, was no longer sealed. It was cracking, one statement at a time, one brave voice after another. And underneath it all wasn't strength. It wasn't heroism. It was fear. Because without the silence, without the protection, without the lies and deflection, Danielle Krauss wasn't a symbol of order. She was a symbol of how easily power can curdle into abuse when no one is watching. But now the whole county was watching. By the end of the first week, the silence that once insulated Officer Danielle Krauss had turned into something else. Abandonment. The woman who once strode through the Monroe County precinct like she owned the floor now found herself walking alone, her footsteps hollow against the tiled corridors. The slap that had detonated in Courtroom 4C wasn't just a moment of disgrace. It was a fault line. And now the aftershocks were collapsing every wall she once leaned on. One by one, her allies, supervisors, partners, union reps, even old friends, disappeared into the smoke. It started with an email, a short, sterile notice from the department. Effective immediately, Officer Danielle Krauss is placed on administrative leave pending internal review. There was no press release, no speech, Just that clinical sentence, stripped of ceremony. Krauss, who once stood behind podiums at graduation ceremonies, was now benched without a badge, a gun, or a paycheck. They didn't even let her clear her locker. Someone else packed it up for her. At first, she believed it was temporary. A pause, a PR move while things cooled off. She called Chief Keel's office twice. No answer. On the third attempt, his secretary finally picked up, but her tone was different now. Flat, cautious. "The chief's in a meeting," she said. "We'll be in touch." He never called back. Her union, the same one that had once defended her through every complaint and internal investigation, now kept its distance. On day 6, her representative withdrew from her case, citing a conflict of interest. When she tried calling for a replacement, the line rang out. Then voicemail. Then nothing. She was radioactive, and the press knew it. Reporters began circling like hawks. Local journalists flooded the department with requests for her record. National outlets sent teams to Monroe. The headlines sharpened. Officer on leave after striking black judge. Dozens of complaints resurface. Years of misconduct? Civil rights groups demand full inquiry. Was Officer Krauss protected by a broken system? The narrative had shifted. It wasn't just about the slap anymore. That had been the match. The gasoline had been waiting for years. Former arrestees started speaking up. First a trickle, then a flood. Jared Wells, a former high school teacher, went live on social media, recounting how Krauss had pulled him over 3 years earlier for a faulty brake light and made him sit on the curb in the rain while she tore through his glove compartment. No citation, no apology. Just an hour of humiliation. "She treated me like a criminal from the moment I opened my mouth," he said. "I didn't even raise my voice." A week later, Alicia Gomez, a grocery store clerk and single mother, told a similar story. Krauss accused her of shoplifting outside a dollar store. No items in her bag. No report filed. "She made my 10-year-old daughter cry, told her, 'You people need to learn.'" Alicia filed a complaint. It vanished. Now, with cameras in her face, she asked a simple question. Why did no one listen when we told the truth the first time? Lawyers joined the chorus. Tyree Hampton, a public defender with over a decade in the county, held a press conference outside the courthouse steps. Krauss was a known issue. She made arrests without evidence, exaggerated danger, used intimidation, and every time we raised concerns, they were brushed aside. But now? He paused, letting the cameras lean in. Now that a judge was struck? Now we're paying attention? The moral weight of that question settled heavily on Monroe County's leadership. It was no longer just about a single officer. It was about everyone who let her thrive. Everyone who turned a blind eye. Everyone who stamped "not sustained" on reports they never read. That's when the petitions began. The Midwest Center for Civil Rights, a watchdog group with a long history of exposing corruption in small-town departments, filed an urgent motion, a full audit of every case Officer Krauss had touched in the last 10 years. Arrests, testimony, search warrants, citations, everything. Within 48 hours, over 60,000 signatures backed the petition. Legal observers demanded a third-party review. City council members, once hesitant to rattle the police union, now held emergency meetings to discuss how many wrongful convictions might be tied to her name. Even her defenders, those few voices that dared to surface online in her support, were drowned out. One post read, "She did what she had to in dangerous neighborhoods." The first reply, "Define dangerous. The people? Or just the ones who didn't look like you?" The department tried to contain the damage. they released a public statement calling for calm. "We are taking these matters seriously. A full internal investigation is underway." But no one was buying it. The public didn't want promises. They wanted transparency. They wanted answers. They wanted names, records, justice. Inside her home, 3 blocks off County Line Road, Krauss sat in a silence she couldn't command. The phone no longer rang with check-ins, no texts, no casual, "You okay?" Not even from the officers she once mentored, once threatened, once told, "Stick with me, and you'll move up fast." That power was gone. What remained was isolation, and the slow, dawning realization that her authority had never really belonged to her. It had belonged to the system. And now the system was backing away. The irony was painful. For 15 years, Krauss had treated criticism like static, irrelevant noise in a world where her badge was gospel. But now, that noise was thunder. It was closing in from every direction. What made it worse was what came next. Archived dashcam footage began to surface. Grainy, time-stamped, but real. A video from 5 years earlier showed her screaming at a black teenager for mouthing off after being pulled for jaywalking. He said he was walking home from football practice. She called him a runner. She shoved him into the cruiser. The clip was short, but damning. And it was just the beginning. Over a dozen local defense attorneys began compiling footage and transcripts. Cases where Krauss had testified, made the arrest, or filed the initial report. Each one now under review. Each one a potential liability. The system had finally begun to respond, but it was too late to erase what had already been done. Too late to undo the careers ruined, the youth criminalized, the dignity stripped from people who never made the news because they didn't have a title like judge. Too late to pretend it was an anomaly. It had been culture, standard, business as usual. And now, the business was crumbling. Danielle Krauss was no longer the storm. She was the wreckage. And the question echoing through Monroe County wasn't whether she'd return to duty. It was how many others had built their legacy on the same silence, and who would be next. The reckoning didn't come behind closed doors. It didn't arrive in the form of a quiet resignation, or a sealed memo from the department, or a carefully worded legal settlement that smoothed everything over and swept it under. It came under lights, in public, with cameras rolling. By the time the Civilian Oversight Tribunal convened, Monroe County wasn't just bracing for justice, it was holding its breath. 7 weeks had passed since the slap. 7 weeks since Officer Danielle Krauss shattered the illusion of professionalism in a courtroom she didn't think she needed to respect. And in those 7 weeks, the ground had shifted beneath everyone's feet. The streets outside the Monroe County Municipal Assembly Hall buzzed with reporters and protesters. Network vans lined the curbs like barriers. There were signs. There were chants. And most telling of all, there were notebooks, legal pads, pens. People weren't just angry now. They were taking notes. Inside, the assembly hall had been transformed. A long, elevated panel wrapped in thick wood and flanked by microphones stood beneath the seal of the city. On it sat the tribunal. A retired appellate judge, a community organizer, a civil rights attorney, a former police officer turned reform advocate, and a pastor who'd buried too many young men taken too soon. They weren't there to prosecute. They were there to expose. And the county made sure no one could ignore it. The room was packed. Residents, legal observers, press. Over 200 seats filled by 9 o'clock that morning. Every camera lens pointed at the same small, silent desk. The one where Danielle Krauss sat in a black blazer. No badge, no weapon, no shield. Her hands folded, face pale, expression unreadable. Beside her sat a defense attorney from out of town, young, sharp, and visibly uncomfortable. The kind of lawyer who knew he was standing at the edge of a story that was already writing itself. Chairwoman Delilah Vaughn, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a voice that could split silence like a blade, opened the session. "This is not a trial," she began. "This is a public examination of the conduct of Officer Danielle Krauss, as it pertains to her role, her record, and her impact on the communities she served." Her words cut through the murmurs. The temperature in the room dropped. Then came the testimonies. One by one they stood. Former colleagues, current officers, lawyers, mothers, teenagers, each holding fragments of a larger truth that could no longer be buried. Detective Lena Torres returned to the microphone, this time without hesitation. She detailed how Krauss had threatened her in the precinct locker room. "She told me if I crossed her, I'd be gone, and I believed her." Her voice didn't waver. Her eyes stayed locked on the tribunal, not once glancing at Krauss. Officer Eli Grafton, now back on active patrol, followed. He spoke about the stops, the quotas no one called quotas, the expectation that certain zip codes were easier. He recounted the day Krauss joked about planting a flashlight under a suspect's seat. She called it insurance, said if they looked guilty, that was enough. Gasps rippled through the crowd. But it wasn't just officers. Alicia Gomez returned, holding up the original complaint she filed 5 years ago. Creased, faded, stamped, unsubstantiated. She recounted the night Krauss searched her car, made her daughter cry, and told them they should know better. Her voice cracked, but didn't break. "You told me to speak up. I did. You just didn't listen." More followed. A pastor whose church had to post signs warning youth to avoid certain blocks when Krauss was on patrol. A civil rights attorney who found Krauss's name in over 40 disputed arrest reports. A black teenager, now in college, who remembered being told by a school officer that "you don't want to cross Krauss. She doesn't ask questions." Each story by itself could have been explained away, as they once were, but together they became a tapestry of systemic failure. Not just one officer gone rogue, but a department that rewarded domination, that wore silence like armor, that valued control more than community. And still, Krauss sat silent. Then, just after the tribunal returned from recess, the chairwoman leaned into the mic. "We now call Judge Miles Harrington." Every seat shifted. He stood from the second row, adjusted his tie, and walked to the podium with the same calm that silenced a courtroom the day he was struck. He didn't bring notes, didn't rehearse, he didn't need to. He buttoned his jacket, looked out across the room, and spoke. "I won't waste this board's time retelling what we've all seen." His voice was firm, controlled, not angry, but resolute. That footage is public record. The strike, the silence, the moment. What I want to address is what came before it, and what must come after. A pause. Pens hovered above notepads, eyes locked. "I've served Monroe County for 12 years. I've seen people make mistakes. I've seen fear, anger, regret. But what I saw that day wasn't a mistake." He turned slightly, not to dramatize, but to look Danielle Krauss in the eye. It was a reflex, born from years of impunity, from a culture that taught her she could act without consequence, that she could judge before knowing, that the uniform meant she could not be questioned. Silence. And if the system had addressed that years ago, if it had listened to the voices you're hearing today, none of us would be sitting here. But we are. And so now we must ask, not just how this happened, but why it was allowed, why it was protected, why it took a viral video for the truth to matter. He stepped back. No dramatic close, No stare down, just calm, deliberate truth. He returned to his seat. The tribunal didn't move. The audience didn't blink. Because what he said wasn't just about Krauss. It was about everyone who looked away. The tribunal's ruling would come later. But by the time the cameras were powered down, by the time the crowds exited into the warm afternoon light, one thing was clear. The system wasn't just being exposed, it was being redefined. Publicly, painfully, but finally. And it began not with shouting, but with a voice that refused to be bent by fear. A voice that said, this wasn't a mistake. It was a reflex born of impunity, and no one who heard it would forget. The vote came swiftly, but not without weight. After hours of testimony, after weeks of investigation and public outcry, the Civilian Oversight Tribunal returned from deliberation with faces that betrayed no conflict, no hesitation. They took their seats in silence. Chairwoman Delilah Vaughn, spine straight, hands folded, spoke the words like a scalpel slicing through the final thread of Danielle Krauss's once untouchable authority. This board, by unanimous decision, recommends that Officer Danielle Krauss be permanently removed from active duty. All departmental benefits and pension privileges are hereby revoked. Further, this matter will be referred to the State Attorney General for formal review. The room stayed still, not a cheer, not a whisper, just silence, cold and thick. Across from the tribunal, Danielle Krauss sat motionless. Her lips were pressed tight, her knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the desk. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But for the first time in her career, the silence that surrounded her wasn't fear. It wasn't deference. It was indifference. That might have hurt more than anything. She rose slowly, flanked by her lawyer, who didn't even attempt a final plea. Cameras followed her out of the assembly hall, but the crowd didn't part for her. She wasn't a fallen hero. She wasn't even a villain worth booing. She was simply done. And outside those walls, the fall of Krauss had already begun reshaping Monroe County's identity. In the days that followed, her name echoed through town halls, classrooms, courthouse break rooms, not as a person, but as a symbol. Not of one rogue officer who slipped through the cracks, but of a system that built her, rewarded her, and protected her for 15 years. Her name was spoken with a kind of grim clarity, the way you say asbestos or rot or poison, not because it shocked anymore, but because it had become familiar. This case has a Krauss problem. That's how you get another Krauss. Policy discussions that once stalled for months now had momentum. Community boards were given access to records they'd long been denied. Public defenders who had grown accustomed to being ignored now found their objections logged, considered, respected. A review team was formed to re-examine 97 cases tied to Krauss's arrest reports. Some had already unraveled, but the story the public couldn't stop repeating wasn't in the policy. It was in the image, the moment a woman in uniform slapped a black man in court, believing she had the right, and realizing too late he was the judge. Back at home, just 15 minutes from the courthouse where she once testified without fear, Danielle Krauss's life folded inward like a closing door. She had moved through the world like a fixed star for over a decade, expecting orbit, expecting order. Now, no one returned her calls. Not the precinct where she'd trained half the current patrol force, not the chief, who had retired 2 weeks before the tribunal with a brief press statement and no mention of her. Not the officers she used to command with a nod or a glare. Silence now filled the spaces where compliance once lived. Her inbox, once packed with shift rosters and department bulletins, now held only spam. Her mailbox delivered more legal notices than letters. Her phone, once a lifeline of control, buzzed only with missed calls from unknown numbers, reporters, lawyers, producers. She didn't answer. Even her own daughter, Avery, away at college, hadn't returned her texts since the day of the slap. Krauss had tried once, just once, to explain. A voice memo sent at 2 a.m., her voice heavy, halting. "I didn't know who he was. He looked like... I thought he..." But she deleted it before pressing send, because deep down, she knew what she had thought. And it wasn't something she could say out loud anymore. She stopped going outside. The neighbors who once waved at her during morning jogs now crossed the street. The man from down the block, who used to bring her garbage cans up the driveway, didn't anymore. They weren't rude. They were absent. The community she once believed she kept in check had moved on, without her. And what haunted her most wasn't the tribunal or the media or the tribunal's vote. It was the new quiet. For years, Krauss had moved through her job with the power of fear. She raised her voice and things stopped. She narrowed her eyes and people obeyed. Her name carried the weight of consequence. Now it carried the weight of shame. And no one feared her anymore. Her days blurred. She stopped checking the news. She stopped opening curtains. She kept the TV on, but never loud, just enough to drown the silence. In her garage, she sat for hours in the driver's seat of her parked cruiser-turned-sedan, gripping the wheel with hands that used to issue orders, issue force. Now they just trembled. No more awards, no more promotions, no more task force panels, just a black blazer hanging in the closet, like a reminder of something that had once meant invincibility, and now meant nothing. The tribunal's decision didn't just strip her title. It stripped the illusion. Because for so long, Krauss had convinced herself that her power came from her work ethic, her discipline, her results. But in reality, it came from a structure willing to ignore what she did, as long as she delivered. And now, that structure was gone. The scaffolding had collapsed, and she was left staring at the ground. She wasn't arrested. She wasn't paraded through court in handcuffs. There was no dramatic breakdown, no televised apology, just a woman, sitting in the wreckage of the authority she once believed she owned, realizing the world no longer made room for the version of her that had once felt unstoppable. She became a footnote, a case study. Her name entered the training manuals under "What We Must Never Allow Again." But she didn't matter in the way she used to. Not as a threat. Not as a protector. Not as a leader. Just a name that now meant failure. Not of one person, but of a culture. And yet, beyond the collapse of Krauss, something else had begun. Not loud, not fast, but real. A culture that once bowed to silence was beginning to speak. The officers who remained no longer laughed at old habits. They attended new trainings, ones that didn't feel like box-checking. Civilians were being invited into policy rooms. Schools began teaching students how to report abuse without fear. A teenage boy in East Hollow asked for the name of the Oversight board chair at his town hall meeting. Not because he was afraid, but because he wanted to apply for an internship. That was the legacy Krauss never intended, but left behind anyway. She built her power on fear, but her fall left behind a blueprint for reckoning. And that, in the end, was what Monroe County remembered. The fall of Danielle Krauss wasn't the end of the story. It was the clearing of ground. For years, Monroe County had been building its house of justice on rot, plastering over cracks with silence and calling it strength. Her downfall, as dramatic and public as it was, didn't just remove one officer, it exposed the foundations. And once exposed, the community faced a question more difficult than any tribunal verdict. Now what? The weeks that followed were quieter, but no less profound. There were no parades, no bold declarations of victory. Instead, there were meetings. Long, sometimes tense, often emotional gatherings in libraries, churches, and municipal buildings. People who had never trusted the system sat across from those who once believed it was working just fine. And slowly, the rebuilding began. At first, the changes came in policy. The Civilian Oversight Board, once a symbolic gesture with limited access and even less authority, was given full subpoena power. They now had the right to review officer records, attend disciplinary hearings, and request footage, not upon request, but as a standard practice. A committee was formed to re-examine not just the 97 cases tied directly to Krauss, but to audit procedures across every division she touched. That included training modules, ride-along evaluations, and even language in standard operating procedures that had gone unquestioned for decades. Bias training, once a checkbox for grant eligibility, became mandatory and immersive, led by outside experts and grounded in real community narratives. Officers sat through sessions where they listened, not talked, listened to people like Alicia Gomez, like Jordan Bell, like the mother whose son had spent 6 months in county lockup because Krauss had written that he looked agitated. The department didn't just shuffle leadership, it restructured it. New command appointments required transparency hearings. Performance evaluations now included feedback from public defenders and citizen boards. Promotions slowed, not because they were denied, but because they were finally earned. But the change wasn't just administrative. It was cultural. It was in the way people looked at each other. Judge Miles Harrington returned to work the day after the tribunal's ruling, just as he had every day since the incident. His presence didn't carry the weight of revenge. It carried the weight of example. The bailiff now opened every session with a firmer tone. Attorneys stood a little straighter. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. Harrington wasn't revered for how he carried himself after being slapped in front of a courtroom. He was revered for how he carried everyone else through it. He didn't seek to punish. He waited, he watched, and he let the truth do the work. One afternoon, after wrapping a juvenile hearing involving a shoplifting charge, a young public defender stopped him in the hallway. She looked nervous, like someone about to ask a question that had lingered too long. "Judge, if you don't mind," she began. "That day, when it happened, how did you stay calm?" He paused, smiled but not broadly, just enough to soften the air. "Because I didn't want to give her what she expected," he said. Then he nodded once and walked on. That answer traveled, not as a quote to the press, but as a lesson inside the courthouse. And outside, it traveled even further. At a packed town hall meeting 2 months after the tribunal, residents gathered in the high school auditorium where fluorescent lights buzzed above folding chairs and coffee steamed in styrofoam cups at the back. People expected anger, but what filled the space was something different: intention. A young 5th-grade teacher named Maya Lynn stood during the open comment period. She didn't speak with outrage. She spoke with clarity. "I don't want another apology," she said. "We've had enough of those. I want prevention. I want policies. I want a system that doesn't wait for a viral video to tell us what we already know." There was no applause, just a long, resonant silence. Then, slowly, heads began to nod. Elders, students, business owners, even off-duty officers sitting in the back row. That was the moment people realized something lasting had begun. In the months that followed, the Monroe County Police Department launched its first-ever community co-training program, where officers and civilians went through de-escalation scenarios together. Local schools began offering civics workshops, not just about how laws work, but how to challenge them, how to report misconduct, how to be seen. The narrative changed. News stories stopped focusing on Krauss and started covering the young officers requesting additional ethics training. Articles profiled the volunteers reopening cold complaint files. High school students submitted essays titled, "What Justice Means in My Neighborhood." And perhaps most telling of all, the fear began to lift. People no longer whispered the word accountability like it was fragile. They said it with confidence, a sense of ownership. When community meetings were held, the chairs filled. When officers patrolled, they now did so with visibility and humility, not armor. Krauss, now living quietly 2 counties over, was rarely mentioned. Her name became shorthand for what must never happen again, a cautionary tale woven into training manuals and internal lectures. She wasn't forgotten. She was absorbed into the story of the county, not as a villain, but as a turning point. Because what she destroyed with her slap wasn't just her career, it was the illusion that authority alone equals justice. That fear is the same thing as order. That silence is the cost of safety. The community rebuilt not by erasing what happened, but by holding it in full view. And at the heart of it all, still presiding from his worn wooden bench, was Judge Harrington, unmoved by fame, unchanged by power, but surrounded now by a county that finally understood the value of restraint, the necessity of consequence, and the strength it takes not to react, but to rebuild. The courtroom where it all started still opened its doors every morning at 9 a.m., but something had changed in how people walked in. They walked in awake. What happened in Monroe County wasn't just about one officer or one slap. It was about what happens when silence becomes policy, when bias is rewarded instead of checked, and when those sworn to protect the public begin to believe they're above it. The fall of Officer Danielle Krauss and the quiet power of Judge Miles Harrington revealed something all Americans need to confront. Systems don't break overnight. They corrode slowly until the truth finally breaks through. And when it does, we all have a choice: ignore it or do something about it. For too long, communities across the country have been asked to accept apologies instead of prevention, to move on instead of speaking up. But this story shows that accountability isn't just possible. It's necessary. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about pattern. And when we look closely, when we listen to those who've been ignored, when we challenge what we've normalized, we begin to rebuild something stronger, more honest, and more human. Judge Harrington didn't raise his voice, but he raised the standard. The citizens of Monroe didn't wait for permission. They forced reform with their truth. And the question now isn't whether this can happen in your town. It's whether you'll be ready to face it when it does. So, what's the lesson? Speak before the slap. Act before the outrage. Don't wait for a camera to tell you what your conscience already knows. Whether you're a teacher, a student, a voter, or someone just trying to get through the day, your voice matters. Your vote matters. Your silence or your courage shapes what happens next. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something real, something urgent, then help keep the truth alive. Like this video, share it with someone who still believes change is too slow, and subscribe to the channel. Because we're not just telling stories, we're holding up the mirror. And we're doing it for everyone who's still waiting to be heard. This isn't just content, it's consequence. So don't scroll past it. Stand up, speak out, and stay watching.